Blood on the boardroom carpet wasn't in Caleb's job description. Neither was hauling his billionaire boss into his beat-up Honda Civic. But when the woman who controlled thousands of lives collapsed, she didn't call for a doctor. She grabbed his cheap shirt collar and choked out his name. Fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, miserable hum on the 32nd floor of Langdon Enterprises. Midnight was approaching, and Caleb Foster was the last soul in the accounting department. His retinas burned from staring at spreadsheet cells, his third cup of vending machine coffee sitting cold and neglected next to his keyboard. He wasn't staying late out of corporate loyalty. He was staying late because his 7-year-old daughter, Mia, needed a pediatric dentist, and overtime was the only math that made sense. Audrey Langdon, the CEO, occupied the penthouse suite 10 floors up. She was a phantom to guys like Caleb, a terrifyingly sharp, impeccably tailored force of nature who fired vice presidents in the elevator and communicated through a layer of executive assistants. She was 42, notoriously single, and commanded a net worth that Caleb couldn't fully comprehend without using scientific notation. He printed the quarterly variance reports, stapled them with mechanical exhaustion, and rubbed his eyes. The protocol was to leave them on the executive assistant's desk on the 42nd floor before morning. Caleb grabbed the manila envelope, badged into the elevator, and leaned his forehead against the cool steel wall as it shot upward. He calculated how much he owed his neighbor for watching Mia tonight. $30, maybe $40 if she woke up and demanded a glass of water. The elevator doors chimed and slid open to the executive suite. It was a different world up here. Thick mahogany paneling, imported wool carpets that swallowed the sound of footsteps, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawling, glittering grid of the city. Caleb walked toward the assistant's desk, dropping the envelope into the inbox. He turned to leave when he heard it. A sharp, ragged gasp. Then the heavy, dead thud of flesh hitting the floor. It came from Audrey's office. The frosted glass door was slightly ajar, spilling a harsh wedge of light into the darkened hallway. Caleb froze. His instinct, honed by years of surviving corporate layoffs, told him to walk away. You don't walk in on the CEO. You don't involve yourself in the affairs of people who can ruin your life with a signature. Another sound. A wet, agonizing cough. Caleb pushed the door open. Hello? Audrey Langdon was on the floor behind her massive marble desk. She was curled on her side, her knees pulled toward her chest. The tailored charcoal blazer she wore was bunched up around her shoulders, and her hands were clamped over her stomach. Ms. Langdon? Caleb stepped closer, his pulse suddenly hammering in his throat. She didn't look like a billionaire. She looked small. Her face was entirely drained of color, glistening with a slick sheen of cold sweat. A dark, terrifying stain was blooming on the carpet near her mouth. Blood and bile. Caleb dropped to his knees. Hey, can you hear me? I'm calling 911. He reached into his pocket, his fingers fumbling for his phone. A hand shot out and gripped his wrist. Her nails dug into his skin with surprising, desperate strength. No. Her voice was a wet rasp, barely louder than a whisper. You're bleeding, Caleb said, his voice pitching up in panic. He tried to pull his arm away, but her grip tightened. No, ambulances. Audrey squeezed her eyes shut, a spasm of pure agony rippling across her face. The board, the stock, no press. Drive me. I drive a 2012 Civic, Caleb blurted out, the absurdity of the situation short-circuiting his brain. "You need a paramedic." "Drive me," she hissed, her eyes snapping open. They were a piercing, icy blue, and even through the haze of whatever catastrophic medical event was killing her, they held absolute authority. "Or you're fired." Caleb stared at her. It was an insane threat, utterly unhinged given the circumstances, but the sheer desperation in her eyes broke through his hesitation. She wasn't just protecting her company. She was terrified. "Fine, okay, fine." Caleb slipped his phone back into his pocket and slid his arms under her shoulders. "I'm going to lift you. Ready? 1, 2, 3. She weighed almost nothing, but she was entirely dead weight. A low groan escaped her lips as Caleb hauled her to her feet, wrapping her arm around his neck and gripping her waist. She smelled of expensive sandalwood and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. The walk to the private executive elevator was a nightmare of staggering steps and heavy breathing. Caleb hit the parking garage button with his elbow. Audrey leaned heavily against him in the descending steel box, her breathing shallow and ragged. She was fading. "Stay with me," Caleb said, his voice echoing in the small space. "Don't pass out. What is it? Your heart?" "Stomach," she gritted out. "Ulcer. I think it burst. Perforated ulcer, sepsis, internal bleeding." Caleb's mind raced through the WebMD horrors he'd read when his own stomach hurt from stress. He dragged her out into the concrete expanse of the underground garage, practically carrying her to his scratched gray Honda. He managed to open the passenger door, carefully folding her into the seat. He swept a stray My Little Pony toy off the floorboard, wincing as Audrey slumped against the worn fabric, her head rolling to the side. Caleb sprinted to the driver's side, started the engine, and slammed the car into gear. Tires squealed against the painted concrete as they tore out of the garage and into the neon-lit midnight streets. The city blurred past them. Caleb drove with a reckless, frantic focus, running 2 red lights, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles were white. Beside him, Audrey was silent. Too silent. Her chest barely rose and fell. "Ms. Langdon!" Caleb yelled over the roar of the car's struggling engine. "Audrey, keep your eyes open!" She didn't answer. The woman who owned half the skyline was bleeding out on the upholstery he couldn't afford to clean. Sliding glass doors parted with a mechanical whoosh, letting in the chaotic, sterile air of the emergency room. Caleb burst through, half carrying, half dragging Audrey. The triage area was a mess of coughing children, sleeping transients, and exhausted nurses. "I need help!" Caleb yelled, his voice cracked, echoing over the dull murmur of the waiting room. "She's hemorrhaging!" A nurse behind the thick plexiglass looked up, annoyed by the volume, but the moment she saw Audrey's deathly pallor and the blood on Caleb's shirt, the apathy vanished. She slammed a button on her desk. 2 orderlies rushed out with a gurney. They pried Audrey from Caleb's grip. She was totally unresponsive now, a rag doll in a ruined designer suit. "What happened?" one of the orderlies demanded, strapping her in. "She collapsed. She said it was an ulcer. It ruptured." Caleb stepped back, his chest heaving, his hands shaking violently. He looked at his palms. They were stained red. They wheeled her through a set of heavy double doors, leaving Caleb standing alone in the middle of the waiting room. The adrenaline that had propelled him for the last 20 minutes suddenly evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, vibrating exhaustion. He backed up until he hit a plastic chair, collapsing into it. He pulled out his phone. 3 texts from Mrs. Gable. Mia is asleep. No rush. Caleb exhaled a shaky breath and dropped his head into his hands. He should leave. He had done his part. He was an employee, not a friend, not a guardian. He didn't even know her middle name. "Excuse me?" Caleb looked up. A young administrative clerk was standing over him, holding a plastic clipboard. "Are you the one who brought in the Jane Doe?" the clerk asked. "She's not a Jane Doe," Caleb said, wiping a streak of sweat from his forehead. "Her name is Audrey Langdon." The clerk blinked. "Langdon? As in Langdon Enterprises?" "Yeah." The clerk's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked it with bureaucratic professionalism. "Okay, well, we need her intake forms filled out. Insurance, medical history, allergies. And we need to contact her next of kin. She's being prepped for emergency surgery. Her abdominal cavity is filled with blood." Caleb stared at the clipboard extended toward him. "I don't know any of that. I just work for her. I'm a financial analyst." "We need someone to sign off on the surgical consent," the clerk insisted. "If she's not conscious, we need her medical proxy or a family member. Can you call her husband, parents?" "I don't think she has a husband," Caleb said. He took the clipboard, staring at the empty white boxes. "I'll try to find someone." For the next 10 minutes, Caleb frantically searched the internet on his phone. Audrey Langdon's Wikipedia page listed no spouse. Her parents were deceased. There were no siblings mentioned. He found the after-hours emergency number for Langdon Enterprises' HR department and dialed it. It went straight to a generic voicemail. He tried the number for her executive assistant. It rang until it disconnected. The woman was a ghost. A highly publicized, ridiculously wealthy ghost. She had built an empire, employed thousands, yet at 1 a.m. on a Tuesday, while she was bleeding to death on a surgical table, there was no one in the world to answer the phone for her. A doctor in blue scrubs burst through the swinging doors. He looked around the waiting room, locking eyes with Caleb. "You brought in Audrey Langdon?" Caleb stood up. "Yes, I can't reach anyone. I don't know who to call. She's in and out of consciousness. We pushed fluids, but we need to open her up right now, or she's not going to make it," the doctor said, his tone clipped, urgent. "She won't let us put her under. She's delirious, asking for you." "What's your name?" Caleb Foster." "Come with me, now." Caleb followed the doctor through the doors, plunging into the chaotic labyrinth of the ER. Monitors beeped incessantly. The smell of bleach and iodine burned his nose. They pushed into Trauma Bay 3. Audrey was lying on a steel bed under blinding surgical lights. Her blazer and blouse had been cut away, replaced by a thin hospital gown. IV lines were snaked into both of her arms. She looked older here, stripped of her armor. Just a frightened, dying woman. "Ms. Langdon," the doctor said loudly, leaning over her. "We have to operate. We need consent." Audrey's head lolled to the side. Her eyes found Caleb standing near the door. "Foster," she whispered. Caleb stepped forward, moving to the side of her bed. "I'm here." "The form," she gasped, her face twisting in pain. A nurse thrust the clipboard at Caleb. Audrey weakly reached out a trembling, pale hand. Caleb quickly unclipped the pen and placed it into her fingers, guiding the clipboard under her hand. "You need to sign the consent line," the doctor instructed her. Audrey's hand shook violently. She dragged the pen across the paper, leaving a jagged scrawl on the consent line. But she didn't stop there. She moved the pen down to the section labeled Emergency Contact and Medical Proxy. Slowly, deliberately, She crossed out the words, "next of kin." In the blank space beneath it, she wrote, "Caleb Foster." Caleb froze. "Ms. Langdon, what are you doing? I'm just your employee." She dropped the pen, her hand falling limply onto the sheet. She looked up at him, her icy blue eyes cloudy with pain, but entirely lucid. "My board are vultures," she breathed out, every word costing her. "My family, cousins. They'll sell the story, pull the plug to divide the shares." Caleb stared at his name, written in her shaky, desperate handwriting. "You didn't call the press," Audrey whispered, her eyelids fluttering. "You didn't leave me. You're it, Foster." The monitor beside her began to blare a rapid, piercing alarm. Her eyes rolled back, and the tension left her body as she slipped into unconsciousness. "She's out! Let's move!" the doctor barked. Nurses swarmed the bed, unlocking the wheels. "Wait," Caleb said, stepping back as they pushed the bed forward. "You're the proxy now, Mr. Foster," the doctor said over his shoulder as they shoved the bed into the hallway toward the OR elevators. "Wait in the surgical lobby. If she codes, we come to you." The trauma bay emptied, leaving Caleb standing alone in the sterile room. He looked down at the clipboard in his hands. There it was, in black ink. The undeniable proof of a billionaire's total, crushing isolation. She had all the money in the world, and in the end, she had handed her life over to a man who couldn't even afford to fix the brakes on his car. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A picture message from Mrs. Gable. It was Mia, fast asleep, hugging her stuffed rabbit. Caleb looked at the photo, then at the empty trauma bed, the weight of a stranger's life settling squarely onto his shoulders. Surgical waiting rooms at 3 a.m. exist in a state of suspended animation. The air is stagnant, smelling faintly of stale popcorn from a nearby vending machine and industrial floor wax. Caleb sat alone in a row of blue vinyl chairs, staring at the scuffed tips of his cheap dress shoes. His white button-down shirt was ruined, a jagged rust-colored stain smeared across the abdomen. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and pressed the heels of his hands into his eye sockets. Exhaustion was a physical weight, settling into his bones like lead. He pulled out his phone. The battery was at 14%. He opened his messages and typed a text to Mrs. Gable. "So sorry. Emergency at work. Going to be a few more hours. I will pay double for the whole night. Please don't wake Mia." He hit send and watched the little green bar crawl across the top of the screen. Double pay meant dipping into the grocery budget. It meant rice and beans for the next 4 days. He let out a long, ragged exhale and dropped the phone into his pocket. The double doors at the end of the hall swung open with a harsh squeak. Heavy, hurried footsteps slapped against the linoleum. Caleb looked up. A man in a pristine navy suit was striding down the corridor. He looked entirely out of place in the grim fluorescent lighting of the hospital. His tie was perfectly knotted, his hair slicked back into an immaculate defensive shell. Caleb recognized him vaguely from company-wide emails. Arthur Hayes, Audrey Langdon's chief of staff, essentially the gatekeeper to the throne. Arthur's eyes darted around the empty room before landing on Caleb. He marched over, his expression a tight mask of controlled panic. "You're Foster, accounting, right?" Arthur demanded, not bothering with an introduction. He didn't wait for an answer. "Where is she? The front desk said she was in surgery. What happened?" "She had a ruptured ulcer," Caleb said, keeping his voice low, acutely aware of the silence in the room. "She collapsed in her office. I brought her here. You drove her? Arthur's face twisted in disbelief. Why didn't you call an ambulance? She ordered me not to. She threatened to fire me. Arthur dragged a hand over his face, muttered a string of curses, and began pacing. Of course she did. The quarterly earnings call is on Thursday. If the street finds out she's incapacitated, the stock will tank 10% before the opening bell. This is a disaster, a complete disaster. Caleb watched him pace. Not a single question about whether she was going to live, just the stock price, the earnings call. Audrey's words in the trauma bay echoed in Caleb's mind. My board are vultures. She hadn't been exaggerating. I need to speak to the surgeon, Arthur said, pulling a sleek smartphone from his jacket. I need to get her transferred to Mount Sinai. This place is a public meat grinder, and I need to get the board on a secure line to draft a press release. Interim leadership protocol. She's in the middle of emergency surgery, Caleb said flatly. You can't transfer her. I have corporate legal on speed dial, Foster, Arthur snapped, stopping his pacing to glare at Caleb. I can do whatever is necessary to protect the company. Before Caleb could respond, the heavy doors to the surgical wing pushed open. A surgeon in green scrubs stepped out. He looked exhausted, pulling a paper cap off his head and wiping his brow with the back of his arm. Arthur immediately intercepted him. Doctor, I'm Arthur Hayes, Chief of Staff for Ms. Langdon. What is her status? I need her stabilized for an immediate transfer to a private facility. The surgeon blinked, looking at Arthur with mild annoyance. I don't know who you are. I'm looking for a Caleb Foster. Caleb stood up. That's me. The surgeon bypassed Arthur completely and walked over to Caleb. Mr. Foster, the surgery was complicated. The ulcer had perforated her stomach lining entirely, and the spillage into her abdominal cavity caused severe peritonitis. We had to do a partial gastrectomy. We removed a portion of her stomach and thoroughly washed out the infection. Caleb felt his stomach drop. Is she going to be okay? She's critical, but stable, the surgeon replied, keeping his voice measured. The next 24 hours are vital. We need to monitor her for sepsis. We are moving her to the intensive care unit now. She's intubated and sedated. She won't wake up until tomorrow morning at the earliest. Arthur stepped forward, inserting himself between Caleb and the doctor. Doctor, as her corporate representative, I am authorizing her transfer. We have a private medevac team on standby. The surgeon looked at Arthur coldly. She isn't going anywhere. Moving a patient in her condition would be a death sentence. Furthermore, I don't care about your corporate titles. Mr. Foster is the legally documented medical proxy. He is the only one who can authorize any decisions regarding her care. Arthur turned to Caleb, his eyes wide with a mix of shock and fury. What is he talking about? Proxy. She signed the form right before she went under, Caleb said. He felt a strange, cold calm settling over him. He was just a low-level analyst. Arthur made 5 times his salary and could probably ruin his career with a single phone call. But right now, in this sterile, miserable waiting room, Caleb held all the cards. That's absurd, Arthur hissed, stepping into Caleb's personal space. She was delirious. You coerced her. You manipulated a dying woman to get your hands on some kind of leverage. I will have our legal team rip you apart. Caleb didn't flinch. He had spent the last 5 years navigating the chaotic, unpredictable tantrums of a toddler. He was immune to bullying. She wasn't delirious, Caleb said, his voice dropping to a low, hard register. She knew exactly what she was doing. She knew if she gave the power to you or anyone else on that board, you'd be drafting interim leadership plans before they even finished sewing her up. Caleb gestured to the phone in Arthur's hand. Which is exactly what you just did. Arthur's jaw tightened. The accusation hit the mark, but the corporate fixer didn't back down. You are way out of your depth, Foster. You have no idea the kind of money and power you are interfering with. I don't care about the money, Caleb said. I care that the woman who signs my paychecks is currently fighting for her life, and you're treating her like a depreciating asset. Caleb turned his back on Arthur and looked at the surgeon. Dr. Evans, keep her here. Give her the best care you have. No transfers, no private doctors, unless you clear them with me first. No one gets into her room except medical staff. The surgeon nodded approvingly. Understood, Mr. Foster. You can sit in the ICU waiting area. I'll have a nurse come get you when she's settled. Caleb picked up his jacket from the plastic chair. He didn't look back at Arthur as he walked through the double doors, leaving the furious chief of staff standing alone under the buzzing fluorescent lights. Morning broke over the city in streaks of cold, gray light. The intensive care unit was remarkably quiet, save for the rhythmic, mechanical sighing of ventilators and the steady beep of heart monitors. Caleb sat in a padded chair in the corner of room 412. He had slept for maybe 40 minutes, his neck violently cramped from the awkward angle. He held a styrofoam cup of black coffee, nursing it more for the warmth than the caffeine. Audrey Langdon lay in the center of the room. The transformation was jarring. The terrifying, untouchable CEO of Langdon Enterprises was gone. In her place was a fragile, pale woman connected to a terrifying array of tubes and wires. The breathing tube had been removed an hour ago, replaced by a simple nasal cannula delivering oxygen. Her face was bruised and devoid of makeup, her dark hair tangled against the stark white hospital pillow. Caleb watched the steady rise and fall of her chest. It was a profoundly intimate thing, guarding a stranger as they slept. He thought about Mia. He thought about the times he had sat by her bed when she had a fever, terrified of the fragility of human life. The protective instinct wasn't something you could easily switch off, even if the person in the bed was a billionaire who probably didn't know his last name until yesterday. Around 8 a.m., Audrey's brow furrowed. A low, dry groan escaped her lips. Caleb set his coffee down and stood up, stepping closer to the bed. Her eyelids fluttered, fighting against the heavy sedation. Slowly, painfully, they opened. Her icy blue eyes were unfocused, darting around the sterile ceiling before finally finding Caleb. For a long moment, she just stared at him. The confusion in her eyes slowly gave way to memory, and then a sharp grimace of pain as she tried to shift her weight. "Don't move," Caleb said softly. "You had surgery. They took out part of your stomach. You're in the ICU." Audrey swallowed, her throat visibly clicking. "Water," she rasped. Caleb grabbed a small plastic cup of ice chips from the bedside table. He picked up a tiny plastic spoon, scooped up a few chips, and carefully brought them to her dry, cracked lips. She took them gratefully, closing her eyes as the cold water melted in her mouth. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome." Caleb set the cup down. "You gave me a hell of a scare last night, Ms. Langdon." She let out a sound that might have been a laugh, but it ended in a weak cough. "Audrey, if you've seen my internal organs, you can use my first name." Fair enough, Audrey. She looked at him, her gaze sharpening, the fog of the anesthesia beginning to lift. The form. Did you? I signed it, Caleb said. I'm your medical proxy, which is a good thing because your chief of staff showed up at 3 a.m. trying to drag you to a private hospital so the board could hide your condition from the shareholders. Audrey closed her eyes. A bitter, tired resignation settled over her features. Arthur, of course. He's Richard Cole's lapdog. Richard has been trying to force a vote of no confidence for a year. Well, he didn't get his way, Caleb said, leaning against the cold metal railing of the bed. I told the surgeon to block the transfer. Arthur threatened to have corporate legal rip me apart. I think I might be fired, actually. Audrey opened her eyes and looked at him. Really looked at him. She saw the blood on his shirt, the deep purple bags under his eyes, the absolute physical exhaustion radiating from his posture. He hadn't just dropped her off. He had stayed. He had fought her battles while she was unconscious. You're not fired, she said quietly. Why did you stay, Foster? Caleb looked down at his ruined shoes. Because nobody else did. Because when you were bleeding out on the floor, you didn't have anyone to call. I know what that feels like. I'm a single dad. If something happens to me, it's just my daughter and me. The world doesn't stop. It just keeps moving. I couldn't just leave you here alone. Audrey stared at him, stripped of her armor, stripped of her wealth. For the first time in perhaps 20 years, she had absolutely nothing to offer a person. No leverage, no money, no power. And yet, this tired accountant had stayed to protect her. I owe you my life, she said, her voice cracking, completely devoid of its usual executive command. You owe me a new shirt, Caleb corrected mildly, and maybe a detail job on a 2012 Honda Civic. The upholstery is a total loss. A genuine, fragile smile touched Audrey's lips. It transformed her face, making her look younger, softer. Deal. A sharp knock on the heavy glass door shattered the quiet moment. Caleb turned. Standing on the other side of the glass was a tall, silver-haired man in a bespoke charcoal suit. Richard Cole, one of the primary shareholders and the most ruthless member of the Langdon Enterprises board. He was flanked by Arthur Hayes and a man carrying a thick leather briefcase, likely a corporate litigator. Richard didn't wait for an invitation. He pushed the heavy glass door open and strode into the room, his eyes entirely devoid of empathy as they swept over Audrey in the hospital bed. Audrey, Richard said, his voice booming unpleasantly in the quiet ICU. A tragedy, an absolute tragedy, but the market opens in an hour and we have a company to protect. He turned his cold, calculating gaze onto Caleb. And you must be the employee who is currently obstructing company business. Mr. Foster, is it? Caleb straightened his spine. He was exhausted. He missed his daughter. He just wanted to go home and sleep for a week, but he looked at Audrey. She was pale, terrified, clutching the thin hospital blanket with trembling fingers. The sharks were in the water. Caleb crossed his arms and stepped directly between Richard Cole and the hospital bed, his jaw setting into a hard line. That's right, Caleb said, his voice deadly quiet. And visiting hours haven't started yet. Get out. Richard Cole chuckled. It was a dry, scraping sound, utterly devoid of warmth. He looked at Caleb the way a man looks at mud on his tires. Get out, Richard echoed, leaning heavily on his silver-handled cane. Son, you are a data entry clerk, playing hospital guard dog. I am a majority shareholder of a Fortune 500 company. I don't leave until I have exactly what I came for. The lawyer beside him snapped his leather briefcase open on a rolling tray table. He produced a stack of crisp, densely typed documents and a heavy gold fountain pen. "Mr. Foster," the lawyer said, his tone dripping with practiced condescension. "The medical proxy you hold was executed under extreme physical distress. It is legally flimsy at best. We are presenting a declaration of incapacity. It temporarily transfers executive voting rights to the board until Ms. Langdon recovers. It's a standard continuity protocol." Caleb glanced over his shoulder. Audrey was gripping the bed sheets. Her knuckles were bone white. The heart monitor above her head was ticking faster, a rapid, frantic rhythm betraying her rising panic. She had built the company from the ground up, sacrificing everything else in her life to maintain it. Now, while she was literally stitched together and bleeding, they were here to steal the keys to the castle. "Standard protocol," Caleb repeated, turning back to the trio. "If it's so standard, why didn't you bring it up to her yesterday afternoon? Why wait until she's half conscious on pain medication?" Arthur Hayes adjusted his tie, his face flushing with irritation. "We have a fiduciary duty to the shareholders, Foster. The market opens in 45 minutes. If we don't announce a stable transition of power, we lose billions. You want that on your conscience?" "My conscience is completely fine," Caleb said. He planted his feet slightly wider. "Because my fiduciary duty right now is to the patient in that bed. And as her medical proxy, I determine who is allowed in her recovery space. You three are elevating her heart rate. You are a medical risk." Richard Cole's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits. The thin veneer of corporate civility evaporated, leaving behind a raw, predatory cruelty. "Listen to me, you insignificant little man. I know exactly who you are. Caleb Foster, senior analyst, salary of $85,000 a year. You live in a rented 2-bedroom apartment. You have a 7-year-old daughter. You are one missed paycheck away from total bankruptcy." Caleb felt the blood drain from his face. The mention of Mia sent a cold, violent spike of adrenaline straight through his chest. Richard smiled, sensing the direct hit. "Walk out of this room, right now. Go home to your little girl. If you do, there will be $100,000 in your bank account by noon as a bonus for your heroic service last night. If you stay in my way, you will be fired before you reach the elevator. You will never work in finance in this city again. I will personally see to it." It was a crushing, overwhelming threat. $100,000 was a new car. It was Mia's college fund. It was sleep filled with peace instead of absolute financial terror. All he had to do was step aside. All he had to do was abandon a woman who had no one else in the world to protect her. Caleb looked at the lawyer. He looked at Arthur. He looked at Richard Cole's smug, victorious face. Then he reached over and pressed the red call button on the wall. "What are you doing?" Arthur hissed. "Security is stationed at the end of the hall," Caleb said smoothly. "I saw them when I walked in. 2 off-duty cops." Richard's face purpled with rage. "You are throwing away your life." "I'm keeping my soul," Caleb replied. "And you're leaving." A burly nurse stepped into the room, immediately assessing the tense standoff. "Is there a problem here, Mr. Foster?" "Yes," Caleb said. "These men are trespassing. They are upsetting the patient. Please have security escort them out of the hospital." Richard slammed his hand down on the metal tray table. "This isn't over, Audrey," he shouted past Caleb. "You can't hide behind a desk jockey forever." Caleb took a step toward Richard. He didn't yell. He didn't raise his hands. He just looked the billionaire dead in the eye with the exhausted, unbreakable stare of a father who had survived worse than corporate bullies. "Get out," Caleb whispered. The men finally retreated. The heavy glass door swung shut behind them, sealing the sterile quiet of the ICU back into the room. Caleb stood there for a long time, his hands shaking slightly as the adrenaline receded, leaving a hollow ache in his stomach. He had just detonated his career. He was unemployed. He had no safety net. A weak, raspy voice broke the silence. "Foster." Caleb turned. Audrey was watching him. There were tears pooling in the corners of her icy blue eyes, not from physical pain, but from something entirely different. A profound, shattering disbelief. "You stayed," she whispered. "He threatened your child. He offered you money, and you stayed." Caleb walked back to the chair and sat down heavily. "I guess I'm just terrible at office politics." Audrey let out a soft, ragged breath. "They're going to try to fire you. I know. They can't," she said, her voice finding a sudden, ironclad resolve. It was quiet, but it was the undeniable voice of a CEO. "Because I'm transferring you, directly under me, Director of Operations, 7 figures. Caleb blinked, staring at her in shock. "Audrey, you're on Dilaudid. You can't make HR decisions right now." "I can do whatever I want," she replied fiercely. "I spent my whole life building a machine, Foster, a machine full of vipers. I thought money was armor. But when I was dying on that floor, the only thing standing between me and the dark was you. You don't buy loyalty like that. You reward it. You protect it." She reached out a pale, trembling hand across the metal bed rail. Caleb looked at her hand. He didn't shake it like a corporate deal. He just gently held her fingers, offering the simple, human warmth she had been deprived of for decades. "Go home to your daughter, Caleb," Audrey said softly, her eyes drifting closed as the monitors settled back into a steady, peaceful rhythm. "I'll be here when you get back." Caleb released her hand, pulled the blanket up to her shoulders, and quietly slipped out of the room. He walked down the long, sterile corridors, his ruined shoes squeaking faintly against the linoleum. When he finally pushed through the sliding glass doors of the main entrance, the bright, freezing morning air hit him like a physical blow. The city was waking up. High above, the glass spire of Langdon Enterprises caught the morning sun, gleaming like a fortress. He drove home in silence, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel of his battered Honda. When he finally unlocked the door to his cramped apartment, he crept down the narrow hallway and pushed open the door to Mia's room. She was sprawling across her mattress, completely tangled in her mermaid sheets, breathing the deep, peaceful breaths of a child who knew she was safe. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, smiling through his tears. He had saved an empire tonight. But looking at his daughter, he knew he already had everything that mattered. Thank you for experiencing this deeply emotional story of loyalty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of wealth. Did Caleb make the right choice in the ICU? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments. If this story touched your heart, please leave a like, share it with someone who appreciates a great drama, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. See you next time.